There has been many concerns on the stability and robustness of the Ghanaian banking sector. Recent developments, including the takeover of some local banks and the difficulty of indigenous banks to meet the 400 million Ghana cedis minimum capital requirement deadline, has dominated much of this discussion. Tonight, we will look at the trends within the banking sector and related issues. My guest for tonight is Honorable Andrew Kofi Ejapa Mercer, Member of Parliament for Sekondi Constituency and former acting head of legal at First Atlantic Bank. My name is Nana Akosia Kunedu Asante Samuels, and this is The Hard Truth. We are proudly brought to you by Murphy Homes, Dawa Industrial City, and Paul's Fitness Gym. You're watching The Hard Truth, and we are proudly brought to you by Murphy Homes, Dawa Industrial City, and Paul's Fitness Gym. Member of Parliament for Sekondi Constituency, Andrew Kofi Ejapa Mercer is here, and he's our guest tonight. Welcome to The Hard Truth, sir.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Have you changed your spectacle?
I think so. Yeah, the last time
you
I came
have,
here,
so you look
yes.
different.
Oh, I do.
You look like our president now. But it's good to have you again, sir.
I guess that's supposed to be a compliment.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Right, but the banking sector, has been facing some difficulties for some time now, or some few years now. And I want to ask whether the situation has changed or improved in your opinion. Has it improved?
Well, good evening to our cherished viewers. It's a huge problem. I guess that is the reason why the Bank of Ghana has stepped up really and is seeking to do more in the regulatory space than it's done before. It's really not clear as to whether the banks that have issues, as opposed to those that have been, taken over and in terms of Capital Bank and UT, and subsequently the Guinea Bank, which has been put under some administration. The issues have been resolved. Of course, that necessarily relates to your capital adequacy ratios. You recall that a few years back, we were told that some 6 banks were challenged. Now 3 have been either put under the commercial bank takeover, and then also the administratorship that the PricewaterhouseCoopers. Right. So we're yet to see whether that in itself is sufficient to address the issues in the financial space. But then again, you know that beyond the banks, the microfinance space is also pretty turbulent. In the recent past, there's been stories all over about microfinance, absolutely. Right. So we're yet to see where the issues would settle. But I guess that the Bank of Ghana clearly is up to its task and is doing whatever it takes to sanitize the financial space.
But the governor of the Bank of Ghana, Dr. Ernest Addison, contends that the poor banking practices coupled with our weak supervision and regulation by the Bank of Ghana significantly, undermine the stability of the banking and non-banking financial institutions. Is that how you see it?
Of course. I mean, if it's coming from the experts themselves, who are we mere mortals to challenge it? Clearly, if regulation is not strong, people will take advantage and abuse the system. And I guess...
So do we blame that on past governors or past leadership?
Well, I would not necessarily want to pass the buck onto anybody.
Right.
But the reality is that we are confronted with a situation that clearly could have been managed earlier. If strong regulatory mechanisms had been put in place in the past, I guess that the problems would have been identified earlier.
Did we know the problems and ignored, or we didn't know at all?
Of course, there's a reporting mechanism that the banking supervision exacts from banks, I believe, on a quarterly basis, even on a monthly basis and weekly basis. So if the banking supervision department is up to task, all the problems would clearly be identified. So yes, I guess that there are some quality personnel in there, except that, some of the decisions that have been taken requires the very top, to make them. So if you have a governor who would rather give the banks an opportunity to resolve their problems as opposed to cracking the whip, then we would be saddled with the kinds of things that we've seen, in respect to Capital Bank and UT Bank and in the recent past, Unibank.
Dr. Addison has, consistently maintained that the banking system must be cleaned to safeguard the financial sector. Again, this cleanup, has resulted in the verification of the licenses. You mentioned that UT and then Capital Banks and the takeover of Unibank right now. Should we expect more casualties as a result of this cleanup?
Well, I guess that if the actions that have been taken so far is not far-reaching enough to sanitize the space, then we should expect that more of those are going to happen. I guess that the clear, rollout of the cleanup, if you like, with the first two and subsequently another one, tells us, and of course the story or the statement that was issued by the Bank of Ghana when the Unibank issue came up was to the effect that they had been given an opportunity to resolve their problems,
And educate me, UT Bank, how much do they owe? Is it 900 million?
I don't know the exact figures, but they will be running into those numbers.
Yes, and then
that's pretty huge.
Okay, so that was a takeover, and then Unibank, it's more than that. So
Absolutely.
Why wasn't that a takeover too?
Well, you see, the issue really with respect to UT Bank and Capital Bank and that of Unibank, I believe is different. The Unibank situation, I guess, that it related to their capital adequacy ratio, and the Bank of Ghana felt that if they were given time, they could lower it to the within 5% that was required. Clearly, that was unsuccessful.
Yep.
And so the decision was taken that in order not to impact negatively on the financial sector, because then again, you must remember that Ghana Commercial Bank has had to take on some huge obligation, and I understand that even their liability, government has to issue some bonds to clear them up. So necessarily taking them over would lead to some cost that the state or the Bank of Ghana or some other party may have to take, as opposed to putting them under an administration with a new management to try and resolve their problems without necessarily incurring the kind of cost that the state or the Bank of Ghana or some third party would have taken.
So I asked
of
if we are likely to see more casualties. So do we have to sit down and wait for that to happen?
Well, that is why the Bank of Ghana is doing what it is doing now. I guess that they have increased their regulatory tempo. The Banking Supervision Department has upped their game in terms of looking at the financials of the banks that were set to be in crisis. And to the extent that only one was put on the administration, I'm inclined to believe, unless of course the contrary is indicated, that most of the problems with the other three is within control, such that the Bank of Ghana thinks that they ought to be allowed to operate. Bear in mind that, I guess, of course, not the guess, but necessarily because of the capital raise that is anticipated to happen by close of year this year, for which almost all the banks have had to submit their capital plans to the Bank of Ghana. That may have informed their decision to either hold on until such time that the capital raising is done, to see where it is that the banks are, and they would give an indication going forward.
Following the turbulence again in the banking sector, there's been much anxiety and uncertainty with many depositors, asking some questions, which bank is next? So in an underbanked country as we have here in Ghana, such as ours, and, with the kind of, alarm bells that we're hearing now, do we, have a risk of facing a loss in the public confidence in the banking sector?
Well, potentially, but I don't think that with respect to what it is that has happened so far, where the Bank of Ghana has sought to guarantee depositors' funds. No depositor has lost their deposit with any of the banks. I guess that in itself gives us some comfort that the Bank of Ghana is capable of resolving these issues.
But again, we're trying to bank a lot more. Before this interview, we hit the street. Many people were saying that they're waiting to, take their monies from the bank and
well,
hold it
I don't think
themselves.
that necessarily would have materialized, particularly having regard to the fact that the banks are still operational. I mean, Unibank, all the customers of UT and Capital did not lose out their deposits. Their branches are still operational. Ghana Commercial Bank has only taken over under the acquisition transaction that was done. So I guess that, of course, there's some legislation that has been passed to protect depositors as well, such that some minimum amounts are subject to legal protection, where the banks are required to set aside some funding to ensure that in the event of crisis, depositors will be protected. So I don't think that necessarily should impact the confidence that people have in banks. In any event, I mean, Ghana is not the first country to have experienced a crisis in our banking space. Even almighty America, the Stearns and Co. had to go on that at a certain point, and there were adequate measures that were put in place to protect depositors. So I guess that if the Bank of Ghana is working well, which I do not have any doubt that they are not, depositors will be protected, even though there are some turbulence that is occasioned in the banking sector every now and then.
Let's look at this. Customer savings and investments, deserve to be secured at, all times. And let's look at the mechanisms. What mechanisms can, the Bank of Ghana develop to provide ratings of banks that can guide prospective customers into, their banking decisions?
Well, in a not so much of a deregulated, in a competitive environment as banking, I wonder to what extent that the Bank of Ghana can provide rating. I mean, people have
but
various
some experts,
reasons for banking with banks.
Some experts again suggest that, BOG should periodically come out with, scorecard ratings, in the banking to efficiently and profitably guide prospective customers into their banking decisions, don't you think so?
Well, I don't know of any jurisdiction that does that, and I guess if it's best practice, then the suggestion that some scorecard should be put in place should be looked at by the Bank of Ghana. But like I said, I'm not aware of any jurisdiction that the central bank necessarily rates banks, and so it's a competitive environment, and people have various reasons, like I was saying, for banking with particular or specific banks, and some even purely sentimental, and so I don't know to what extent that some scorecard regime would help in informing customers as to which bank to bank with. Then again, most people in Ghana do T-bills and all that through banks, and those are not necessarily affected whether the banks go down or not. The Central Securities Depository that has custody of all those instruments. It's only the banks only play an intermediary role, and so I don't think that is the way to go. But then again, look, if it is best practice, it is practiced in some jurisdictions that people know of and can point to. I guess that the Bank of Ghana would take a close look at it and implement it if that is the way to go for the banking space.
Right, but Andrew, many of the problems in the banking sector are as a result of, bad corporate governance. Let's look at the issue of culpability and accountability, of managers of the collapsed bank. The principal factors that caused the demise of the two banks were, poor banking. Where poor banking practices existing within the banks. And Dr. Ernest Addison again asks a critical question: can we hold, the supervision staff who were in charge of the, culpable for some of the things that happen in the industry? So can we hold them to that?
Well, of course, even the company's code in itself makes directors, responsible for the running of every corporate entity, and the requirements within the banking space is even much more onerous, such that before you are even approved as a director of a bank, you need to pass the fit and proper person test that is set by the Bank of Ghana. So I guess that yes, the combination of the requirements under the Banking Deposit Taking Act in itself and of also the company's code makes it imperative that persons who are the controlling minds of banks and who necessarily ought to abide by some principles in the corporate governance space, in the bank's own credit risk assessments and all that, if they renege in the performance of those obligations, then some we ought to exact some accountability from them.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Hard Truth, and we are proudly brought to you by Murphy Homes, Dawa Industrial City, and Paul's Fitness Gym. Member of Parliament for Sekondi Constituency, lawyer Andrew Mercer Ejapa is still here. Master Sanema.
No, it's fine.
It's fine. Good.
Yeah.
Right.
Save that you don't have to let people have the impression that my surname is Ejapa.
Okay, so let me pronounce it properly. So it's Andrew Kofi Ejapa Mercer.
That's fine.
Okay,
yeah.
good. Now, the Association of Indigenous Universal Banks presented a petition to President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo to extend the recapitalization deadline date from 2018 to 2022. But it seems the central bank is resolute in maintaining the 2018 deadline. So what do you make of this move by the indigenous banks?
Well, they need to try to get some executive.
Is their call a valid call?
I do not think so, particularly in view of the fact that the central bank is supposed to be independent from executive control. So I wonder to what extent that they
So in your view or opinion, were they to petition the central bank?
Absolutely. That is where they should direct.
Haven't they done that already?
Well, I'm not aware whether they've done that already, because I'm sure that the association engages the central bank quite regularly, and so it is entirely possible that they've channeled their concerns to the central bank and they've given them a clear indication that they are resolute in their determination to get them to comply with the 400 million.
So let's say, the president, side with them and petition the central bank to extend. What if that happens? What happens?
Well, the central bank would have to take a decision whether they would.
But that wouldn't make them independent enough, would it?
To the extent that the president is not issuing a directive to the Bank of Ghana, then their independence is still in place. I would think that it wouldn't be proper for the president to intervene. But then again, he is the leader of the country, and if people make representations, he is enjoined to listen to them and to make a determination one way or the other about the petition that's been brought to his attention. But I think that without necessarily saying so, the Bank of Ghana have their own agenda, not negative, but having the broad overview of the entire economy is of the view that it is important for the banks to have a certain financial muscle to enable them to do bigger ticket transactions. And so as to whether all of them can raise the 400 million within the time frame is something that I don't think is possible. And I'm sure that the Bank of Ghana themselves
in 2 years
are
you give this amount, in the next 2 years, they gave certain
I'm sure that the
timelines.
Bank of Ghana themselves are aware that it is practically impossible for most banks.
So are they forcing a measure? Do you think they're forcing a measure?
It happened in Nigeria. I think they're trying to do the same here. I mean, I recall that in 2008, when they issued they increased the minimum capital requirements from 7 million to 60 million. Yes, they granted the Ghanaian banks some concession to do 25 million by 2010 and 60 by 2012. But the clear objective at the time was to get many of them to consolidate. Unfortunately, that did not happen. It was only Trust Bank that joined EcoBank. First Atlantic was supposed to be part of that transaction, but some way, somehow, they managed to raise the capital independent of the attempt by Bank of Ghana and the shareholders at the time, including SNET, who at the time was a majority shareholder in both Trust Bank and First Atlantic, to get the three banks to consolidate. So I guess that having failed at that time, well, not necessarily failed. but not succeeding in their quest to consolidate the banks at the time. This new governor having come in thinks that, look, it's about time that we get this thing done, and that is the reason why they've increased the capital to the levels that I believe would really force many banks to consolidate.
So if the Bank of Ghana yield to the demands of the indigenous banks, should we or should such extensions be for all indigenous banks or for all banks?
Well, for purposes of fairness, I guess that all the banks...
Should be for all.
Yeah, but you know, like the indication that I just gave clearly tells you that in 2008, the Ghanaian banks were given some latitude as opposed to the foreign-owned banks. They were, enjoined to do the 60 by 2010, and the indigenous banks were to do the 60 by 2012. They were given an additional 2 years to do that. So yes, it is possible that the Bank of Ghana, when they are minded to review their decision, may want to segregate the capital requirements for Ghanaian and non-Ghanaian banks and give them separate timelines to meet them. But I think that without necessarily saying so expressly, the objective of the Bank of Ghana is to get the banks to consolidate. So I would be extremely surprised if they budge and concede to the, if you like, demands that the indigenous banks are making. Of course, I'm not mandated to speak to the Bank of Ghana, but my own assessment is that that is their clear objective.
Per the petition of the Association of Indigenous Banks, it would again seem that the 2018 deadline is, if implemented, or, many of the banks cannot comply. So what are the implications of this?
Well, the implications would be that if you're unable to meet it, then you lose your license. But nobody will want to lose their license. And so that would necessarily lead to some mergers between the banks. So
well, but they have also warned, that an enforcement of the 2018 deadline may force local banks to fall into the hands of foreign investors who, already have the, proposals to take over some of the local banks. Do you, envision more foreign participation in the banking sector in this regard?
But of course, if they don't merge, and retain their local identity, and they are unable to meet the minimum capital requirements independently within Ghana, then they would have to fall to the international market to raise the funding. So really, the choice is theirs to make. Either they consolidate and retain their Ghanaian identity, or go their separate ways, and because they cannot raise the 400 million internally, resort to foreign players to, as it were, invest in the banks and become foreign-owned.
But given the level of capital, of the capital of indigenous banks, 2 or 3 indigenous banks will not, have to merge to attain a minimum capital of, 400 million. Even if the local banks agree to merge, can the merger of 2 or 3 banks be achieved within the short period of 1 year?
I think it is possible. If there is clear commitment, it doesn't take, I'm not sure it would take that much to consolidate. In any event, they've had some time to provide their capital plans to the Bank of Ghana. So if the commitment is there from the beginning that, look, we want to retain our Ghanaian identity, and the only way to do so is to do a rights issue, which, from my experience, many shareholders will not have the wherewithal to put up, and they do not intend to consolidate, amongst themselves, then it will be a tough one to achieve. The Ghanaian banks would have to fall off into the hands of foreign-owned players.
That's right. Well, the Council of State has advised, indigenous banks to, which could not meet the capital requirement, to enter into a measure in order to compete favorably with the union to ensure sanity in the banking sector. Do you agree with the Council's position?
Fortunately, yes, I do, because the finance minister has consistently maintained that the capital level of our banks are really low, such that even for cocoa syndication that we do annually, Ghanaian banks cannot participate in it. And this is, I mean, easy income that foreign banks take away every year. Because there's a guarantee for repayment of those facilities. But Ghanaian banks cannot play in that market, in that space. But if they consolidate, and we have, say, 2-3 banks in Ghana, 4, 5, if you like, as opposed to 34, and they have the muscle to do the syndication, clearly all that income that every year goes out will stay in here, and that can clearly, be channeled into the development of this country. So well, maybe unfortunately for the Ghanaian banks, but I tend to side with the view of the Council of State that some consolidation of Ghanaian banks ought to take place so that we can enjoy the benefits that come with it in our country.
Right. The board chair of Stanbic Bank, Emmanuel Asiedu-Mante, he's of opinion that the local banks have a phobia for measures. And Mr. Al-Hassan Mahama Idris, an investment banker and accountant, believes that the phobia is an understatement and that, the measure is horror for them. Why do local banks fear, measures? And is the Western world in this case too? Do they also fear that?
I don't think so. I mean, it's just cultural. We all know that the Ghanaian, well, let me not generalize it that much. Many Ghanaians or some Ghanaians think that, owning 100% of $1,000 is better than owning 10% of $1 million.
No, but if the Western world do not fear a measure, why do we fear?
That's what I'm saying, that it's cultural. I mean, people want to point to some...
That is my bank.
Yeah, that is my bank, as opposed to saying that is our bank. In the Western world, they pool resources together and do some of these things. But in our part of the world, people want to do it individually. And so that in itself creates a problem. And with the kind of industry that we're talking about, the bigger, the better. The bigger your balance sheet, the better it is for the kinds of things that you do, and the bigger your profitability. Because if you are bigger, then of course you can play in transaction sizes that the risk associated with them are relatively lower, as opposed to the small and medium scale market that is more riskier. So yes, I think that we ought to realign our cultural thinking and go the way of measures that clearly would be beneficial for the economy. In any event, the whole idea of savings and loans and microfinance institutions is to cater for that segment of the market where the capitalization of banks is not that onerous, and so it is not the case that the measures would lead to medium and small scale industries not being able to access financial services in the country at all. That clearly is not the case.
Healthy competition within the banking industry should propel a downward trend in the interest rate, but rather there's been high interest rate spreading. And I want to ask, what is accounting for this disconnect?
Well, I guess a multiplicity of factors, and the banks will always tell you that the risk profile of the transactions that they do is such that they always have to have some premium, associated with the on top of the base rates that they charge. Of course, lack of difficulty in locating customers, lack of addressing systems, proper address systems in the country have all been stated as reasons why cost of credit is so high. So with the new thinking of digitizing the country through the digital address system, the national ID card system coming in place, and all that, I guess that would potentially lead to reduction in the cost of credit, because then those reasons that the banks give would no longer exist, and necessarily cost of credit will have to come down.
The Bank of Ghana governor again, Ernest Addison, has stated that the underlying cause for high interest or lending rates is a question of the cost of the bank, and the need for the bank to be more efficient. Banks passing on their inefficiencies to your customers? Can I ask that?
I guess so. And then, of course, I mean, if the Bank of Ghana governor is saying so, it must be based on some data that is available to him as the chief regulator of the banks, and so it leaves too little room for me to question the basis of his statement. And I think that largely, well, you may say that the inefficiencies of the banks is a factor, but all the other factors that I enumerated a short while ago, I guess, also tends to play a role in the cost of credit. And so if those issues are resolved and the cost of credit still doesn't come down, then of course the inefficiencies of the banks would stand clearly as the reason why credit is still high. And I guess that would require regulators to do what it is that needs to be done to ensure that they comply and be much more efficient, so that the generality of the people within the economy can derive benefits from a lower cost of credit in the economy.
Despite significant reduction in the monetary policy rate, which now stands at about 18%, reduction is a cost of credit and has been, marginal. Why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, same reasons that has been trumpeted. And I think that the new guidelines that the Bank of Ghana has issued for banks to, as it were, guide their cost build-up would somewhat help in bringing some clarity to why it is that cost of credit is high. And ultimately, I think that it would begin to trend downwards, because if people see that some banks are charging for their inefficiencies, they will be compelled to go to banks where the efficiency is much more better to enable them access credit.
Is there any bank like that who have lesser inefficiencies?
Well, I guess that it's a new regime that has been implemented, and it's only a matter of time that we can see to what extent that in itself helps in that regard. So I guess that we'll have to give it a little bit of time to see what impact that new guidelines would have on the cost of credit.
I see, but the president of the Ghana National Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Nana Apija Dankwaso, says that he believes that the commercial banks are undermining the competitiveness of the businesses and eroding their profits with high interest. Is that how you see it, or is that the case?
Well, these are value judgments that I do not have any basis to question. But then again, clearly from his perspective as a businessman, he's entitled to his view. I'm sure that if you...
But isn't it too much? Ghana is noted with the highest banking lending rate, 35.5% in Africa.
It's unjustifiable. I mean, I think that it's unjustifiable, and it would have to come down some way, somehow. All the factors that they have attributed as being the reason why cost of credit is high, I am saying that steps are being taken to resolve them. So if those issues are resolved, then it is expected that cost of credit will trend downwards. But if it doesn't, then clearly we'll have to take a second look at what it is really that is driving the cost of credit so high. And if it takes regulation to ensure that comes down, I'm sure that the Bank of Ghana will take the appropriate steps at that point to ensure that happens.
A new reference rate for lending, that is the Ghana reference rate, was introduced by the Bank of Ghana to serve as a guide in the setting of interest rates for the banks. Many experts also see a reduction in the lending rates with the introduction of the reference rate. So what would happen if that happens? I mean, there is an interchange in that.
Well, like I said, I mean, this new reference guide was introduced, I believe, less than a month ago. And so the understanding is that it will bring some transparency in the computation of the cost of credit. And people can clearly assess each individual bank to make a determination as to whether they are competitive or not. And my expectation, I believe the expectation of the Bank of Ghana would be that this new reference guide would help banks to lower the cost of credit. It will only take time for us to make an assessment of its real impact. Until that happens, I think that we'll just have to give it a little bit of time to see what we can really make a meaningful assessment of what the impact of this would be on the cost of credit going forward.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. You are still watching The Hard Truth. We are proudly brought to you by Murphy Homes, Dawa Industrial City, and Paul's Fitness Gym. Member of Parliament for Sekondi Constituency, Andrew Kofi Ejapa Mercer, this year. I have the longest name on TV ever.
But I asked you to
yours
skip
is,
the middle ones if you so desire.
But
I don't have any problem. Now,
so what do you make of the, of the Bank of Ghana? The governor. What do you make of him? Do you think that he's doing well? Are you happy with his performance?
Absolutely. I mean, he is a systems person. I mean, institutional. He's worked in Bank of Ghana for the longest, and
so the president didn't make the bad choice in selecting.
Not at all. I mean, and I've not heard anybody question his competencies at all.
But I'm curious. What critical areas do you think he ought to, look at, and that he's not really doing? Which would that be?
Well, I guess you'd be asking the wrong person because I have not looked at the negatives.
So
I think that he's doing
so you think he's fine? So don't you need improvement in some areas? So don't we all need improvement?
I think that he's doing excellent. With the role of the Bank of Ghana in regulating the banks, economic management, and everything. All the economic indicators so far is trending in the right direction.
I see.
And so yes,
I see.
Unless of course you can point to some specific actions of his that clearly sit well. I'm extremely satisfied with the work that he's done so far. And look, I'm not an expert in economics. In fact, I know very little economics. The A-level economics that I did is the only economics that I know. But as an observer of the financial space, I think that we have a central bank governor who is doing excellent, and he needs all the commendation and encouragement to do more so that we can get to the destination that is excellence.
What would you think? Let me just play the devil's advocate here. Let's look at Wampa. Let's compare performances. Did you think that Addison is doing better than Kofi Wampa did? I mean, what would you say?
I don't think that's a fair question to ask. I did not follow Mr. Wampa's or Dr. Wampa's work closely. But then,
so why are you following Ernest Addison closely? Is it because he was appointed by President Akufo-Addo, which party you belong to?
The economy that Dr. Wampa presided over, and what Dr. Addison is presiding over, you can draw your own conclusions.
I can't.
I guess that he has his own competencies. Of course, at a certain point, is the president found the need to ask him to exit for a new person to come in. Dr. Shahaku, I believe.
Shahaku.
And he took over from Dr. Wampa. Of course, when the new government came, clear misalignment of economic priorities led to Dr. Shahaku's resignation and subsequent appointment of Dr. Addison. I mean, since he took over the reins of the Bank of Ghana, together with the government economic management team headed by His Excellency the Vice President, I guess that we are all witnesses to the work that they're doing. Yeah.
But really, Dr. Addison has on several occasions, suggested that when he took over the financial sector, was in turmoil. Do you think his predecessors, left him a mess?
But the economic mess that the government of His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo inherited is well documented. I mean, all the economic indicators show quite clearly that the managers of our economy were not doing such a great job, and necessarily had to resort to the the IMF for what they termed policy credibility. Signed a 3-year contract that this government was compelled to stick with. And His Excellency the President has given the clearest of indication that will complete with the IMF, who have indicated that as opposed to the April end date, they would rather they do the full budget cycle or they exit now. And so government agreed to do the full budget cycle with them. So December 2019, I believe, will be the end point of our relationship with IMF. And that has been done before.
So again, I mean, go straight to the question. Do you think his predecessors left him a mess? That's the question.
I do not intend to make a call on that. I guess that the Ghanaian people will be the better judges. There's a governor who is presided over
the
economy, which interest rates clearly is trending downwards. Inflation has dropped significantly and continues to drop. Our debt to GDP ratio is declining from 73% to 69.8% in 1 year. Our budget deficit 9.5 to 5.6. Of course, they're doing well, and I guess that it's only a matter of time that all these achievements, in our economic management will translate, and reflect in the lives of the greater majority of our people.
What do you make of the current brouhaha about allegations of double payments to some former government appointees?
It's unfortunate that, of course, I know some of the names that have been mentioned to have been engaged in that line of collecting double salaries. I guess that we have to allow the CID to conduct a thorough investigation, because people's reputations are at stake. I mean, I knew of this issue quite a long time ago, that some members of parliament who were also subsequently appointed as ministers of state, instead of being paid the differential between their members of parliament salary and their ministerial salaries, were actually being paid double salaries. One from the office of parliament, who would not necessarily be privy to what pertains at the chief of staff's office, where ministers are paid from, or where instructions for salaries of ministers of state are issued from to the Controller and Accountant General to effect payment. What will be taking place there? I guess they were the ones who were supposed to ensure that the appropriate salaries, additional, were made to these persons. As to whether it was deliberate or not, I guess only a thorough investigation can reveal that. And of course, the persons who were involved, I guess that they also owed a duty to the people of Ghana to be candid and, point out to the authorities that, look, I'm not entitled to these salaries that you are paying me. But then again, it's early days. Like I said, reputations are at stake. And so it behoves on the CID to conduct a thorough investigation into the matter to ascertain the truth or otherwise of these allegations.
But the minority
recommendations made for the stemming of these things if they ever recur.
I see, but the minority is also accusing the government of witch hunting. What do you think?
I don't think this is witch hunting at all. The truth of the matter is that these double salaries were actually paid. What I've heard some to be saying is that, well, we were not in control of the payment, so you can't blame us. Come on. That cannot be right.
So what are they supposed to do? Return the money? Don't
absolutely,
pay me?
Yes. I mean, even if wrong credits are made to your account, that doesn't translate into ownership of those funds to you. It doesn't. And so I guess that talk of witch hunting really is just appealing to pity, if you ask me.
Let me ask you. I'm curious. Any ministerial, ambitions for yourself? Tell us. Do you have any ministerial ambitions?
I'm a politician, so I'm ambitious, I guess. But I do not have the power of ministerial appointments.
Are you lobbying
His Excellency the President, who has the sole prerogative.
Yes, but are you doing some lobbying for some positions?
He has made his selection of competent and capable.
I know, but we hear of a ministerial reshuffle. So I'm asking you, you're beating about the bush. Do you have any ministerial ambitions?
I hear things different from what you hear.
Which is
I haven't heard of any ministerial reshuffle in the offing.
I see.
Yeah.
But if there is, which seat will you be eyeing?
If His Excellency the President deems me capable of serving in any capacity in his government, I guess that
tell us. Tell us which of the ministries. That's what this plays very, very well.
This was not part of the
of the banking scope
of the subject matter that you indicated to me we'll be discussing.
Well, this is a hard truth. Things happen. So seriously, final question. Any ministerial ambition? Any ministerial ambition?
I indicated to you that I'm a politician. So, of course, I'm ambitious. But it is not within
what steps are you doing the lobbying? Have you started talking to some big people within the party?
I don't talk to anybody. His Excellency the President is well grounded. He, I guess, has his eyes and ears on the ground. He knows the capacity and competences of all the people that are in his party.
What of trade? What of trade ministry? Really, do you think you fit well, for say deputy trade minister?
I'm not answering any of those questions.
Andrew, it's a pleasure having you in the show. Thank you so much, sir. Andrew Ejapakofi Mercer is the Member of Parliament for Sekondi Constituency. Thank you so much, sir, for coming to being our guest for tonight. Send a comment or your comments to our pages on your screens right now. That's our social media pages on your screens right now. And you've been watching The Hard Truth. We are proudly brought to you by Murphy Homes, Dawa Industrial City, and Pulse Fitness Gym. Catch a repeat of the program tomorrow morning at 9 to 10 a.m. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Nana Akusia Kunedu Asante Samuel. Have a good night.